Hello there, and welcome to another episode of CinemaSlice Education. This is the History of Film, Part 2. Today we're going to look again at the Eduqas Film Studies GCSE. This is from Component 1, Paper 1, and in Section B of that paper there's one multi-part question. It's only worth 5 marks, but it is 5 marks that you want to get hold of in your exam, and it focuses primarily on the developments in film and film technology. So we looked at this last time. There are 10 points of information on the Eduqas approved 10-point list, and these what you need to learn almost off by heart or remember a lot of the details from, the dates and all the events that took place. Today we're going to be looking at points 4 to 6, which occurred between 1927 and 1948. So from the advent of sound all the way through to the Paramount Court Case. We're going to be making some notes on those, and there'll be some questions that I get frequently asked when I'm teaching this, and a quiz at the end of the whole thing. So what do you need? First of all, you need a note paper and the exercise book to continue from the previous notes. You need a place to watch this video, write some of those notes down, so make sure you've got some space. And you could do with a separate piece of paper for the quiz at the end, so you can close your book and test your memory based on what we've been talking about today. In your notes, please write the heading Film History Part 2. And a little pause sign will come up, so you can just pause and make sure you've got that written down. Right, moving on. The first point that we're coming to today is point number 4, and it's 1927 and the sound revolution. The Jazz Singer is a film released by Warner Brothers, and it has a synchronized soundtrack. It stars Al Jolson, and it caused absolute shockwaves in the industry. A lot of the movie studios really quickly pivoted to making sound films, or talkies as they called them at the time, as quickly as they could. There's kind of a double controversy which we need to talk about really quickly here. You might, if you Google around on Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer, you might see some of the news reports about how it uses something called blackface, which is incredibly problematic, especially as it's in the news a lot at the moment. So if you do want to watch all of the Jazz Singer, and fair play to you if you do, then you need to be warned in advance that there's a lot of blackface during the course of it. In addition to that, there is some controversy around whether or not it is the first sound film. The Jazz Singer is the first full-length feature film, that means it's over an hour long, that features a fully synchronized soundtrack, and it is that, and it did cause shockwaves in the industry. So whereas sound was used a few different ways beforehand, this is the first full-length film that has a fully synchronized soundtrack. Second bullet point there is popularity. It was one of the most popular films released at the time. It caused the rest of the industry to sit up, take notice, and change the way that they made films. There are some limitations in the early recording of sound. The Jazz Singer was a sound on disc film, so they recorded the sound onto a disc at the time, and obviously that brings with it a lot of complications, especially when it comes to editing the film at the end. So we're going to have a quick look at a clip from the Jazz Singer and have a look at some of the synchronized sound, and especially the first line, which I think you should see, the very first line where people were sort of taken aback at how they could hear this guy talking and see him talking at the same time. So here we are. This is the Jazz Singer. It's a fantastic YouTube video which contains some additional information about what was going on in the film. I'm just going to talk over it a little bit. This is the very, very start of the film, and he gets up on stage to sing a song. Everybody's over the moon about it.
That's what they say, but to me,
but people had heard songs being sung before because you play a record along with it. It was the synchronized soundtrack of him talking.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you, you ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Tootsie? All right, hold on. No, listen, play Tootsie.
And that was what shocked audiences at the time, was being able to hear Al Jolson sing and talk afterwards. So that was the Jazz Singer. That was what shocked audiences at the time, was being able to hear him talk. And the wait a minute is quite a famous line, and one of the first audibly heard lines in a film by audiences up and down the country in America. So I get asked a lot of questions whenever I do the coming of sound, because it's really strange for modern audiences to think what would it be like watching a film with sound for the very first time because we're so used to watching films like that. And they asked questions like, how did they record it? So they recorded it onto a wax disc, like a record at the time. They moved on to sound on film, which is where you get those perforated film strips that play the sound as they run through the projector. But back then it was just sound on a disc that they recorded at the same time. Sound did exist before. There were a lot of different gimmicks, a lot of different experiments that people did. This is just the breakthrough moment where they managed to synchronize it with the film at the same time. Silent films, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, they died overnight. The studios, a lot of them shut for a few weeks while they figured out how they could record things too. They signed up all these different companies that offered different sound recording techniques, and it changed the industry for good. You suddenly need an awful lot of extra people to work on every single film because you need a sound department. You need a group of people who are going to work on the sound design. They're going to work on the actual recording and the synchronization, and the editing process becomes so much more complicated because you're not just editing the visuals, you're editing the sound to match those visuals as well. So if you get your paper ready, the pause sign will come up in just a second. Here are the points that you need to get down. This is point number 4. It's 1927, The Jazz Singer. You need to make a note of the fact that it starred Al Jolson and it was directed by Alan Crosland. And you also need to make a note of the really important point is this is the first feature film. So like I said before, that means it's over an hour long with a synchronized soundtrack. Okay, moving on to point number 5, and it's 1935 now, and we've got the introduction of Technicolor. This is Robert Mamoulian's film, Becky Sharp. It's the first feature-length film, like I said before, that means it's over an hour long, to use the 3-strip Technicolor invention. I'm supposed to give a brief history of colour here. Colour was used from the film's very inception in a variety of different ways, but mainly films are in black and white. The ways you could colour films were by using really simple processes like actually painting or drawing onto the film itself before you projected it to see if you could get some colour. And there were what's called additive and subtractive processes whereby you add the colour in afterwards or you subtract the colour out of it and try and film on different strips of film and then lay them over each other. Technicolor is the latter of these. It's a subtractive process and it splits the film into 3 different strips. And it's a really complicated way that it does that. But what it eventually means is that when you play them back and you lay those strips over each other, you get a really bright, garish set of colours. And audiences were kind of enchanted by this. It made things look really, really incredibly luxurious and interesting to look at. The most obvious one of these Technicolor films that I can think of that you might have seen is The Wizard of Oz, that made a great use of the Technicolor 3-strip process. But Becky Sharp was the first to use that in a feature-length film release back in 1935. So we're going to have a look, instead of a film clip, we're going to look at the trailer for Becky Sharp, which is like a sales pitch for the film, and it makes a really, really big deal of the Technicolor process. I have been asked what Becky Sharp is like. It's a tremendously dull film. It's really, really boring. So I don't advise watching it, but if you want to, more power to you. Go for it. You do you. But for me, it's quite a dull film. Technicolor was definitely the next big hurdle that people in the movie industry wanted to conquer after sound. They thought if they could get films into really bright colours along with sound, they would look amazing. And as you can see, Becky here dressed like some kind of clown. It's an interesting look. So here's the trailer for Becky Sharp. It's an RKO film, and they are announcing that at last the screen has become the palette for life's great canvas. What they mean by that is we're going to turn it into colour. Oh, magnificent. I'm afraid that the picture quality is a little bit blurry, and that what you might notice from the colours is that they kind of fuzzily bleed into each other a little bit. And that's because the Technicolor process hadn't been perfected at this point. It was really early point while they were making Technicolor films, and they hadn't quite got down the way of making the colours kind of stick to their area. So if you look at that white writing, it seems slightly soft and fuzzy at the edges, and that's because it's not quite a perfected process just yet. Let's have a quick look. The next shot here, look at that gentleman's bright red jacket. Oh, incredible to see. And there she is, dressed like a clown again. Pleased to see him, I'm sure. So, moving on, what are the questions that I get asked? One of them is, how does Technicolor work? I tried to briefly explain that before. It's quite complicated. If you want to have a look at the Wikipedia entry for it, uh, then go ahead. It's not an easy way to work out. It's called a subtractive process, by which that means when you record it, you take away different elements of the color and try and put them onto different photoreceptive sets of film and then play them back over each other. And that's the three strip process, because you split it into the green, the blue, and the red different color areas that you record in. And those are the three different types of film. Um, not all films would colour immediately after this. It was a really expensive process. The studios did it, and you can see from that trailer that they were really selling Becky Sharp on the fact that it was a colour film. That was a big deal to them. Uh, Technicolor isn't really used anymore, certainly not very often in films, because films are digitally recorded. But that means that up until the mid 2000s, they were still using Technicolor. The process had been refined and it was really sharp, clear, crisp colours by that point, but they were still using it about 15 to 20 years ago. Here are your notes to make. The pause sign will come up in just a second to give you a chance. It's very short this time though. Point number 5, 1935, the Technicolor Corporation. Please make sure that you put down that this is a separate company. The studios would lease or hire the equipment, and they'd also hire the Technicolor Corporation to do the process of developing the film. Becky Sharp was the first feature-length 3-strip colour film. Important to make that note too, that it was Becky Sharp and that it was a 3-strip colour film. Okay, point number 6 is, we're not going to watch a clip for this one because it's the Paramount Court Case in 1948, and this is the end of vertical integration. It halts this closed shop approach, and it's the first crack in the studio system that we talked about in the previous video. We now get the rise of the independent studio. So, vertical integration that we mentioned last time, is that good? Is it a good thing? And for the studio, they certainly thought it was. But for an awful lot of other people, they thought it was a really, really bad thing. Because if you have vertical integration of production, distribution, and exhibition owned by 4 or 5 studios, what you've got there is what's called a closed shop. That means that if you wanted to make a film and you wanted to get it distributed and shown at theatres, you couldn't, because all the theatres were owned by the studios and all the distributors were owned by the studios. And obviously they're not going to show your film when they can show the film that they've produced. And what you get there is a monopoly of a few companies. That's called an oligopoly. It's when you get a small group of companies together and they control the whole industry. They could also control entry to the industry. So if you didn't play by their rules, if you were an actor or if you were a producer or a director and you didn't do what they wanted you to do, then you just didn't work. That was it. You couldn't make a film and you couldn't get it shown, which meant you couldn't make money off it. So when the Paramount Court Case came along, it was a court case that sort of said that they weren't allowed to do that anymore because it was too controlling. It's called an antitrust case, and they decided, the studios mainly, to sell off their exhibition. Those were the biggest risky areas because you had to actually own and run a cinema chain, whereas production and distribution, you don't interact with the public in any way there. It's a lot less risky for those people as a business, so they got rid of exhibition. 2 of the practices that the studios used to get up to that really upset the people who brought the court case forward were block booking and blind buying. Very alliterative stuff. Block booking meant if you wanted to buy a Warner film to show in your cinema, like you had a big hit film with James Cagney coming out and you wanted to show it in your cinema, you had to buy 10 films from Warner's. You didn't get a choice over what the other ones were, and you had to just show all of those films just because you wanted that one James Cagney film. In addition to that, you didn't get to see the films before you bought them, so you had no idea of the quality of those films. You just had to take them in blind and hope that they would end up being attractive to audiences so you could make your money. What happened with the Paramount Court case after they got rid of the exhibition was that independent studios and independent producers and agents who could put films together and get films made sort of rose up and started to fill some of the gaps left by the studio. Now, I tried to find an example for you to look at while I was doing this of an independent film studio that came up, made a film during the 1950s, so following on from the court case in 1948. And the case study that I came up with was the Blob. So in 1958, 10 years after the court case, you got the Blob, and it was made by Fairview Productions, not a major movie studio, and it was purchased by Paramount. Paramount bought it and then decided to distribute it as well. It starred Steve McQueen, who was an actor who was one of these early sort of range of actors who didn't have a studio contract. They weren't signed to an individual studio. Studio contracts were really restrictive for actors. They had to work for that studio for 7 years under a standard contract. If they decided that they didn't want to do a film that they were told to do, then time would get added onto the end of their contract. They could be hired out to other studios. They didn't have any choice in what they were doing. It was a really, like I said before, the idea of a closed shop. You did what they said or you weren't in the business. So, some questions that I get asked usually when I teach about the Paramount Court case. Was the decision ever overturned? No, and I'll explain the decision a little bit more. It was a huge moment in US law. It's still cited today as one of the most important cases for business monopolies and antitrust cases. Essentially, they decided that too few people were controlling too much of an industry and it wasn't fair and it ruined competition. These few studios could get together, and they did do this, and they could meet and they could decide to set prices, and they could decide to jack up the prices in cinemas, or they could decide that they were going to keep somebody out of the industry, and it was all too safe for them. There was no risk. Why did they get rid of the exhibition wing? Well, it was partially down to the ruling, which suggested they should get rid of that, and also partially due to the money. It was more profitable for them to keep hold of the studio and the distribution. Distribution is a bit of a strange one. People often say, how do you make money from distribution? Well, before digital distribution, so we have Netflix now, so we can watch films just through our television, and the distribution goes through a cable in the ground. But back then, you had to actually distribute the film physically. You had to get these big film reels, stick them in vans, and drive them all over. Now, if you own the company that owns all of the vans, and you decide, I'm not going to take those films to the cinema, that breaks down the entire studio chain. So distribution is really, really profitable, and it needs to run well for a studio to continue to make its money. So if you don't drive, I've written there, if you don't drive, then the film doesn't get there. Was it better or worse after the Paramount Court case? Well, for everyone who wasn't a studio, it was pretty good. You could make a lot of money, you could enter into the industry a little bit easier. The movie studios weren't so keen on it. It meant that they had less control. And it was also the start of the end for the movie studios. 20 years later, after this, they would start to collapse, some of them entirely. Here are the notes that we're going to make. So the pause symbol will come up in just a second. This is point number 6, 1948, the Paramount Court case. What did that do? It prevented the studio from owning all 3 phases of the film industry. They had to make a choice. It led to the 1950s emergence of agents and independent studios. And agents and indies would produce films for studios to distribute. Now, I'm going to just point out a little odd thing in the notes here. The timeline says that the agents and indies would produce films for the studios to distribute and exhibit. But actually, most of the studios sold off their exhibition. So I think that might be a bit of an error, but because it's in the 10-point list, we're going to stick with it. So put the and exhibit down into that note as well. Okay, we're going to have another quiz. So if you want to put away the notes that you've just made and get a fresh sheet of paper out, we're going to test your memory a little bit and see what you can remember from those 3 points that we've just gone through. Here are the questions. In what year did Al Jolson appear in The Jazz Singer? Can you remember what year that was? Question number 2, what was the name of the company that provided the colour film process for Becky Sharp, and what was the process called? And question 3, the 1948 Paramount case led to the rise of 2 new producers of films that weren't major Hollywood studios in the 1950s. Who were these 2 groups of people or people who started to produce films in the 1950s? Give it a pause and have a go at answering that question. Okay, here's some answers for you. Number 1, 1927 was the year that Al Jolson appeared in The Jazz Singer. Number 2, the Technicolor Corporation invented the 3-strip process. And number 3, agents and independent producers were the people who came along and started making films as well as the studios. I'm Mr. Warrington, and that brings us to the end of the second of what's hopefully going to be 3 videos in this CinemaSlice Education run where we're doing film history. If you need to contact us, then you can find our information just below this video, and we'll see you next time.